Hello.
Morning.
Hi, everyone. Paul, do you want to kick it off so long? I think most of the agenda items are yours.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a delivery I had to accept at the front door. Okay, so without looking at the agenda document, I know that I put two things on the agenda. The first one is that the initial pull request for the SIG charter should have been merged by now. And I wanted to let folks know about that. There was some review from steering committee members that felt that what was merged was overly specific. I found it extremely difficult to understand exactly what level of detail is required. So if somebody would like to take that up and work through that, I think that would be fine to do. Although I'm personally comfortable with the state that it was in, which is being very specifically defined around existing pieces of software. I wonder what others think about that.
I can take a look at the current charter that's merged and see if I can suggest any changes that I think might be necessary.
All right, that would be great. Let me just make sure that it was actually merged. Okay, there we go. It was merged. Great.
I think there's a bit of a tension between, on the one hand, we want as a Kubernetes organization to have, most areas covered by a SIG, so that when somebody comes along and says, I'm doing X, we can tell them, okay, go to SIG Y, because they have that in their charter. But on the other hand, you don't want all SIGs claiming to be responsible for everything, in which case, there are multiple SIGs responsible for everything. So it's a question of getting the scope narrow enough that it doesn't overlap too much with other SIGs, but also broad enough that it catches things that are not necessarily currently being done.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can appreciate the nuances there. I think this might be easier as there are more charters that are actually merged to kind of look for ones that are good examples. Yeah, I found it a little vexing to try to get that right. So that would be great, Quentin, if you could take a look at that.
Sure.
The next thing that I had put on the agenda was that we had a really productive discussion in the last SIG meeting around the proposed addition of something called cluster credentials to the cluster registry API. I took a pass through that pull request and pushed an update that addresses some of the review comments that folks left. The biggest thing I would say about that is that I tried to add a lot of specificity about exactly what should be in the secret key that's referenced to contain information about user. So I wanted to let folks know that per our prior discussion, I'd done that. And then also we have been kind of discussing whether it wouldn't be more useful since like the concept of an open-ended thing that you will somehow use with an arbitrary cluster seemed to be a little ambitious. We were kind of wondering amongst Maru and Ivan and myself, whether people thought it would be useful to kind of de-scope this API in the sense of really what I'm talking about is just a rename to something more specific so that we aren't trying to grab like a very general concept. And one of the suggestions that we came up with is, do people think, since this API really is about declaring that a health check should be performed against a cluster in the registry, would it make this easier to reason about if the API itself was renamed as something like health checked cluster? So no need necessarily to answer right now. I raised the question on the pull request, but that was something I had wondered about opinions in the group about.
Is this separate to the credentials that are part of it, or you require credentials in order to do the health checking portion of the API?
It adds specificity in the sense that it frames the API around performing health checks. And that seemed to be something that, like, if I think back to our last discussion, might have helped bring some, framing to the conversation. And I certainly have had like the Kubernetes, just personally speaking, that it's kind of cringe-inducing to grab large conceptual spaces with names. So I just thought it might be something that, one, would have a better indication of what the API actually does for you, and then two, let us examine the problem space without feeling like we have to solve arbitrary open-ended questions, as I think we were kind of grappling with last time. Does that make sense, Christian?
Yeah, let me try to be more specific. Are you saying basically that in how you want to define what you are actually health checking, you actually do not need to authenticate?
No, I am saying that like a change that has been made to the pull request is that at the time of the last SIG meeting when we discussed it, it was very open-ended in terms of like the documented semantics of the API around using a kube config. John Motor made a very good suggestion I incorporated to a set of changes that I pushed that narrows that down, for example, from must have a kube config file to a very specifically defined proper subset of a kube config file, like specifically a users array and a single user. So that's one dimension where I felt in the last conversation it was kind of working against us that it was so general, right? Like, and we were butting up against, for example, that there's no API to describe a kube config, et cetera. And in general, my feeling was I think it would be easier for us to discuss this if the entire thing was more specifically scoped.
I just had a question, Paul. So stepping back from the specific PR to the problem we were trying to solve. So the problem we were trying to solve is that the cluster registry as it stands today it enables people to list clusters, but it doesn't actually enable them to do anything beyond that. So they would have to, the next logical step to do anything with the cluster would be to be able to authenticate against it. And that's what the federation control plane needs to be able to do, for example, and that's what most users need to be able to do to use the cluster registry. And with the cluster registry as it stands today, they would have to build another thing which communicated how people authenticate with that cluster, potentially with keys and credentials and whatever. And in the absence of that, people were not using the cluster registry because the thing they had to build was approximately as complicated as the cluster registry, and therefore we wanted to solve that problem. So I'm not sure that what we're actually trying to solve here is a health checker. I think what we're trying to solve is making sufficient API objects available that a user, or a user being a piece of software or a human user, could find out which clusters are available and then connect to the ones that they're allowed to connect to.
Right.
Which sounds like a cluster credential to me. I can understand that kubeconfig is actually more than just credentials. It has a list of users and it has a list of clusters and various other things in it. So I understood the argument against the kubeconfig-based cluster credential, that it was contradictory to the API design, in that there was stuff in a kubeconfig that did not fit with the rest of the API that was proposed. Not that we should narrow to health checking, because that isn't actually what we're doing.
Yeah, and Quentin, that is not lost on me. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we rename the API. I'm wondering if bringing some specificity to it, and if like health checking isn't the right dimension of that, like maybe there's some other name that we can arrive on that might make it easier to talk about. So the other dimension of this, though, is that like adding specificity around exactly what you will use to configure those auth credentials. I think that was one issue last time, right? That it, like, the semantics of having an entire kube config and a secret aren't super clear. So we can address that dimension by adding specificity to the contents of that kube config. I also wondered if it would pay to like descope somehow from something as broad as cluster credentials as something that might, make it more tractable to get an agreement onto something, and that we could use in a future more general API. Does that make sense?
Kind of.
It can make sense, and you can disagree with it at the same time. Just for the record.
Yeah. I mean, we're trying to solve a specific problem, which is enabling people to connect to a cluster. And we should use a name that is representative of that. There may be other problems worth solving, like health checks and other things, but that isn't the problem that we set out to solve here.
Yeah, I gotta echo that. I have the same concern. That's why when you meant health checking, I asked about, are you still authenticating, or what's the purpose? It seems orthogonal.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
But
so I think the answer to my question is it does not help to reframe the API this way.
No, we just need to define something that enables someone to authenticate against a cluster.
So maybe
cluster credential was a fine word for that, but there might be better ones.
Yeah, I did not change any names in the pull request. So what I will draw folks' attention to, assuming that we still want to talk about this, is that, let's see, I'm using Zoom on my phone because it continually crashes for me, so I'm not able to share my screen here. But
can everyone see my shared screen? I can display something if you want me to.
Okay, if you could pull up cluster registry number 261.
Is it under Kubernetes SIGs?
It's actually under Kubernetes, so it's Kubernetes / cluster registry.
Is that a PR or a?
Yeah, it's pull request number 261.
Quinton, the link is in the docs which you had opened prior to this.
Yeah, I think I'm nearly there. Is this the one?
Yes.
Looks like it, yeah.
So if you head on down to line 203, I will just call folks' attention to the more specific semantics that I put into the latest version of this, where I say that secret ref is a credential, or sorry, is a reference to the secret in the namespace that contains a kubeconfig with credentials. And I just really failed at writing prose here, but the salient point is the secret must have a key named kubeconfig that contains a file formatted as a proper subset of the kubeconfig file format. The data must contain a kubeconfig file with only the following fields: a user section and a single valid entry in the user section containing the auth information to use with the referenced cluster. So John, I'm not sure if he's on today. But he had a very good suggestion or interesting idea to me that the exact semantics would be that you took the single user entry in the secret here and used that with the endpoints defined in the cluster resource to construct a kubeconfig file to use to access the cluster. And I think that addresses some of the concerns that folks rightly had during the last SIG meeting about the level of detail and specificity. But I wonder if what folks think about that.
Sounds good to me. The only concern I would have, and maybe I can just add these comments to the PR rather, is that I'm not sure that there is a well-defined thing called a proper subset of a kubeconfig file. So it's not clear what exactly that means. If someone were to try and write something that was conformant, I don't know if there's a good spec for what that subset is, because there isn't a spec for kubeconfig. But other than that concern, I think this is the right direction.
Is there a reason you can't create a type?
So I would say I'm not sure that having a first class, well, let's decompose that question. I think perhaps it would be doable to have an API type that was expected to be deserializable into from the secret. But I think that the actual data we would want to be stored in a secret.
That's fine. But
okay,
if you have a type, then it looks more like an API rather than something that's documented in mays and shoulds in text.
Yeah, right. Let's see, I guess here's where I would ask a question to the group of, do we think that it's possible to kind of reverse engineer that API for the serialized content? Or is that something that we should ask SIG CLI for? I mean, the basic formulation of, like, for example, basic auth I'm pretty sure that we could look at kubeconfig files and guess that, right? I would really not necessarily want to solve or gate on having a formal kubeconfig API. So to avoid doing that, I would be definitely open to having a well-defined API in the cluster registry for what was expected to be in this file.
Yep, I mean, I think you'll find those types in the CLI.
Okay, it sounds like that's a productive next step then, that I can take as an action item.
Yeah. One other idea that came up that we could follow as an alternative is to adopt the approach where we don't care what's in there. Whoever puts that in there needs to be responsible for ensuring that it can be placed in an appropriate place and used to authenticate. And if that appropriate place is inserted into a kubeconfig file, then that works for kubeconfig. And if that place is something else, then as long as they put the right stuff in there, it'll work. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but it is one way of getting around the fact that we don't actually have a definition of a kubeconfig file at the moment, as far as I'm aware.
That's sort of what I was going for with the latest revision that is being, shared on your screen. But yeah, the programmer in me really likes the idea of having some like minimal API that we can say you should be able to deserialize into this. Okay, I'm happy to take this as an action item to work through, and I appreciate everybody, being okay with this usage of time. I certainly don't want to dominate the meeting though today with this one pull request, so I'm happy to move on unless we want to keep talking about this.
Sounds good.
Thanks for your time and patience. I have to leave early today. So I'll see everybody in 2 weeks and follow up on the PR.
Chris, just before you leave, I just added to the future agenda items what you mentioned to me a week or so ago. So it's, yeah, just give us a shout when you want to give us an update on MCI.
Yep, will do.
Yeah, Christian, one more thing. So there might be some updates which are needed at KubeCon. So that's what is the last agenda item today. So you can, you need not necessarily put that up right now. You can probably send in one-on-one.
Yeah, we have a SIG intro and a SIG deep dive at KubeCon in China in 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks time, I guess. So yeah, we need to find out what we should say there regarding kubemci and anything else.
Okay.
So I'll initiate a slide kind of a thing, probably based out of the last KubeCon update that we have, and anything new that we have done after that, I'll incorporate and send out the link. People can update over there. That works fine?
Yeah, fine for me.
Fine, yeah. I'll read the meeting notes a little later. Thanks, Irfan.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so that's that for the agenda items for today.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
See you guys in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
See ya.